Hi, guys. I want to give a very short lecture right now, looking at a specific aspect of the Paris Peace Conference. I want to focus on four of the world leaders that I feel were particularly responsible for how horrifically the Paris Peace Conference ended over the course of the next 20 years. But let's review a little bit first. So the day that I think Koreans know as Pocky Day, and here in Shanghai we know as Singles Day, is actually a very sacred day for West Europeans. It's known as Armistice Day. It's the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. I brought that up before, but it has to do with what happened in this train car in the very beginning of winter of the last year of the war. Everybody met in northern France, and it was not technically the Germans surrendering to the French and the British, but it kind of really was. So they got together in northern France and they agreed to stop shooting at one another, but there was no misunderstanding between anyone, any of the generals and leaders who met in that train that you see on your screen right now, that the Germans no longer could continue fighting. This Armistice Day is still observed. I don't want to use the word celebrated, that seems a bit crass, but it's still observed today. And it's a big deal with young children, actually, particularly in Britain, France, I think in Germany and Belgium too. Okay, so what I really want to focus on is the Paris Peace Conference. And if you look at this famous painting that I'm projecting on your screen right now, if you look at the gentleman seated right in front of you at the center of the painting, they're extremely significant actors. You're looking at the leaders of France, Britain, Italy, and the United States of America, our president. They're in the Palace of Versailles, which used when France was a monarchy before it became a republic in the French Revolution. This is where the emperor lived outside of Paris, France. And this is a very famous room within the Palace of Versailles called the Hall of Mirrors. The Hall of Mirrors is a very large hall. More importantly, for what we're studying right now, it was in this room that they made some of their most momentous decisions. Okay, so I apologize for the poor quality of this image, keeping in mind that these images are now 102 years old. But what you're looking at are the four men that I personally hold most responsible for the Paris Peace Conference causing so many problems after the war. And these problems have endured. I said this, I don't know, a week or so ago, and I want to repeat it because I think it bears repeating. The mistakes made during the Paris Peace Conference are so egregious that your generation will be tasked, just like my generation, with solving them. They tangled up the world in a lot of really awful ways that haven't been untangled peacefully since. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them. But let's talk about the architects of these different treaties to deal with the losers of World War I. The German Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Bulgarians were the losers, and each had a specific treaty to deal with the terms of their loss. The most famous treaty is the Treaty of Versailles. And the reason that that's the most famous is because of the three empires and Bulgaria, Germany was the most powerful and was the closest to winning World War I as well. Okay, so who are we looking at in this pixelated photograph? Well, collectively, the four of them are known as the Big Four. They represent the four most powerful combatants on the winning side of World War I. The Paris Peace Conference was extremely racist. All kinds of people, all kinds of non-white diplomats and leaders were invited to participate, and then when the treaty negotiations progressed, if you weren't white, you got shut out. And I'm bringing that up because the four men that you see right here, I'm going to tell you who they are in a moment. But the four men that you see right here collectively were known as the Big Four. It's a historical term, but it's also a term that was used in newspapers of the day. All right. The reason that I'm highlighting this is because in the very beginning, let's talk about January and February, the first 2 months of the Paris Peace Conference, they were known as the Big Five. And the fifth world leader that you're not seeing here from another great power who was on the winning side of World War I was Japan. I don't remember the name of the diplomat representing Japan, although he was famous. Um, but originally, it was the five leaders of the five great powers that had the most power at the Paris Peace Conference. Now, everybody who participated in World War I sent diplomats to Paris to negotiate these different treaties and to get what they could out of the surrender negotiation. So everybody was there, including the countries that you guys are citizens of. But what's interesting is not everybody had an equal vote, and this is a very serious problem. But even so, even if a certain small elite group of people had more power than not, in the beginning, at least through that one leader of Japan, at least East Asia's interests were considered. And very quickly, and very much due to racism, the representative for Japan was pushed out, and we were left with the Big Four. So the Big Four represent the major states that won. The first guy you see here is Vittorio Orlando from Italy. He was the least important of the four, and eventually, just like Japan was pushed out in the first 6 weeks or so of the Paris Peace Conference, later as the months passed, Vittorio Orlando, the leader of Italy, representing Italy's interests in trying to get that land up in Austria and along the Adriatic Sea, he was pushed out too. So, about halfway through the negotiations, the Big Four, who had an inordinate amount of power, became the Big Three. Why was Italy pushed out? Again, racism. So, he didn't speak English very well, and Italians at the time weren't considered, I don't know, fully white, if you will. Okay, the next two leaders are David George. He was the Prime Minister of Britain, and then Georges Clemenceau of France. These were the two countries that fought along the Western Front. So this is who Paul and his company and all quiet on the Western Front. These are the armies that they're confronting. Both of these men had a lot of power in the Paris Peace Conference. Both of these men wanted the same thing, and that is one, more land, two, they wanted Germany to pay for all the damage, and three, they wanted to make sure that Germany could never rise up again. That was a really important point, particularly for the French, because the French had been invaded successfully by the Germans just 50 years before in the middle of the 19th century. Now, the last player at the Paris Peace Conference arguably had the most power, and he's the President of the United States. His name is Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson is an interesting character because if I'm going to tell you what he wanted, I think your initial impression is going to be like, well, he's a good guy. Yeah, maybe. A couple of things, though, I want to balance out your opinion of him. Number one, he was an incredible racist. Now, you could make the argument, Mr. Sanders, in the beginning of the 20th century, everybody was racist, and you would be correct. But even by the standards of those times, Woodrow Wilson was a horrific racist. He had a particular problem with black Americans and black Africans. You might find this interesting. He was a very famous history professor at Princeton University before he became the governor of New Jersey, and then from the governor of New Jersey, he became the president of the United States. While he was a history professor at Princeton University, his lectures were so famous that students would crowd in just to hear him speak on the various topics that he was teaching. Princeton University, after he became president, actually named their International Relations School after him. And I want to say it was called the Woodrow Wilson Institute for Peace. That's not right, but I'm close. But anyway, Princeton University's very highly regarded international relations program was named after Woodrow Wilson. And I want to say 3 years ago, at the most 4 years ago, students and activists within the United States had the name of the school removed because Woodrow Wilson was just a horrific racist, even for the year 1919. Okay, so let's go through what each one of these men wanted, and then I'm going to give you some vocabulary terms. While I'm talking, make sure your notebook is out right now and you got a pen or pencil. Okay, so Italy, more than anything, wants land. This is part of their irredentist dream. They want to recreate the Roman Empire. They're going to start off small, but they were bribed by Britain to betray their allies, Germany, in return for a chunk of lands that would have been taken from Austria and some more chunks of land taken from the Balkan Peninsula. France wanted to make sure that Germany paid for war damages and that they couldn't invade France again. Britain, more than anything else, wants to make sure that their empire, the largest, extremely profitable, the largest empire in human history and extremely profitable for the British Empire, that none of its lands are threatened by Germany or any of Germany's allies. So they want to weaken Germany. They also want to weaken Russia, which is perhaps a story for another day. Woodrow Wilson, very different. Here's what Woodrow Wilson wants. He wants peace without victory. So he goes into Paris, France, lauded as a hero. Supposedly, when he entered into Paris, throngs of people lined the street to watch his car drive through and to applaud him. Now, this is all part of that concept of modernism where people believed they could use science to make a perfect utopia. They believed that Woodrow Wilson, the president of a state, of a nation state, not an empire, also an academic, he was this famous historian, like I told you, would be able to usher in a period of time where war would no longer be a solution. That's where we get the nickname for World War I, the war to end all wars. Woodrow Wilson himself, in his own words, talked about a peace without victory. He said World War I was a terrible accident and no one should pay the price after that. It was a mistake and it'll never happen again. Now that we realize the lethality of second industrial revolution technology, we'll never do it again. Obviously, he was wrong. Second thing he wants to do. He's not directly attacking monarchy, but he's very clear that he wants to make the entire world democratic, much like the United States. Unfortunately, this isn't entirely true because we go back to the problem of Woodrow Wilson. While he had good ideas, he was an incorrigible racist. And as a racist, if you were if you were a non-white citizen of a country that was traditionally non-white, he didn't care about you being democratic and he didn't care about protecting your independence. So this vision of his is excellent, but it's very selective. It's only applied to the world that he considers white. Okay, and again, as I said, he and others were referring to the Great War as the war to end all wars. They believed that war would never be used again. Okay, so here's the terms you need to know. Woodrow Wilson, before he arrived in Paris, France, to attend the Paris Peace Conference, came up with 14 separate solutions of how to achieve a peaceful, utopian-like world in which war would never be used again. That plan is called the 14 points. It's not very long. We could easily read it. It's vague in general, which is why you can read it so quickly. I'm not going to ask you to do that right now. Just be aware that Woodrow Wilson's plan to make a peaceful world is called the 14 points. The 14 points rested on two ideas, two important ideas. The first is the concept of a League of Nations. A League of Nations is exactly like the United Nations. The idea is that whenever there's a conflict between two states, instead of the conflict escalating and evolving into a war, instead they would take their conflict to Geneva, Switzerland, where the League of Nations headquarters were, and they would discuss it face to face, and the other states in the world who were not involved in the conflict would hold the trial and decide what the solution to the conflict should be. On paper, it was a fantastic idea. In reality, it was a huge failure. That's a discussion for another day. Okay, the second the second foundational principle of the 14 points is the concept of self-determination. You need to write these three things in your notebook, and you should probably put an asterisk next to self-determination because, in my opinion anyway, this is the most important term and concept you need to know to understand the 20th century. Self-determination is the idea that if you are a nation, and you remember the definition of nation, it was the second unit of study this year in my course, that if you are a nation and you live traditionally in the same piece of land, then you have the right to create a state. So the cultural unit that you belong to should also become a political unit. Now that's important because what self-determination means is the world should be divided up into a series of nation states. Clearly, by basing this new peaceful utopian world off the concept of self-determination, Woodrow Wilson was clearly communicating that empire is a bad thing, empire should be replaced, and empire should be replaced with countries, with nation states. That's hugely important. He failed in realizing this dream. And even attempting this dream, you could argue, leads to World War II. But what's important is after World War II, after the second chapter of this war of imperialism, self-determination is going to go into full effect, again led by an American president, and the empires will be disbanded, and the earth will be divided into all of these nation states. The world that you live into the world that you were born into is a world that rests on this fundamental concept of self-determination. That if you are a group of people, if you are a nation, and you've been in the same piece of land for centuries, then you have the right to create a country or a nation state. All right. Other thing, and I want to do this fast. Hopefully you read this and you're going to read it in the reading that I signed that goes along with this lecture. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles is the biggest reason that Adolf Hitler was able to ethically justify starting World War II. It says this. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles states that Germany takes all responsibility for World War I. That is to say, World War I is only Germany's fault. Kaiser Wilhelm II is absolutely guilty of making terrible decisions as the leader of Germany that led to World War I, but he is not the only one responsible, nor are the German people the only ones responsible for World War I, but because they lost the war, they were forced to sign this Treaty of Surrender, and in this Treaty of Surrender, all responsibility was placed on their shoulders for fixing the damage that was caused. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles is now known as the War Guilt Clause. And the War Guilt Clause is going to provide a great piece of propaganda for Adolf Hitler to take advantage of to convince the German people that they were wronged by the negotiations at the Paris Peace Conference. This War Guilt Clause, and with some other reasons that I'll explain later on, was also used to put a lot of the blame on the Jewish people of Germany and the Jewish people of Europe at large. Okay, guys, that's it. The next thing I'd like you to do is the reading. It's from a book published for British school students. You'll notice it's a little bit old, but it's also very good and it's also very simple. It'll read quickly. While you're reading it, as you run into information that seems important that you haven't learned already, please commit it to your notebook. Bye, guys.